There was once a little boy who did not know that he had been promoted. Not in school, not in sports, not in anything specific, but in life itself. He was 2 years old when the new baby came home. The house changed that day, quietly, completely. The air grew softer, slower. Every sound seemed to echo, and he, the elder one, noticed it first. He noticed how his mother's hands, once always reaching for him, were now full of bottles and blankets. How her smile, still warm, carried the exhaustion of someone learning to love twice at once. He noticed how his father's laughter had shifted, gentler, quieter, directed somewhere else. No one told him to grow up, but somehow he did. He stopped calling out at night. He stopped asking to be carried. And when the baby cried, he fetched the toy before anyone asked. He didn't do it out of duty. He did it out of love. But love, at that age, can become a burden when it grows faster than understanding. The world called him such a good boy, but no one asked if he wanted to be good. No one asked if he was tired. You see, children learn through patterns, not lessons. He noticed that when he stayed calm, his parents smiled. When he helped, they praised him. When he stayed quiet, they stayed peaceful. And so he learned the oldest rule in a busy household. If I am easy to love, I will be loved. That is how early maturity begins. Not through wisdom, but through need. Not through choice, but through adaptation. He was too young to name what he felt, but something in him started building walls. Thin, polite walls made of patience and silence. Walls that said, "Don't disturb, they have enough to handle." And each time he swallowed a feeling, those walls grew taller. Years later, he would be praised for his self-control, for how dependable he was, for how understanding he seemed. But underneath that composure was a small, trembling voice that never learned how to say, "I'm sad." He loved his baby sibling, truly. He felt proud to hold them, to fetch toys, to watch them sleep. But there were nights when he'd stare at the ceiling and feel something strange, a sadness he didn't recognize, a loneliness that didn't make sense. Because how can a child explain missing something he doesn't even know he lost? This is the paradox of the elder child. They grow up in the presence of love, but in the absence of attention. They learn to be strong before they are ready. They become caretakers before they finish being cared for. Psychologists call this parentification, when a child, emotionally or practically, takes on the role of an adult. Sometimes it's obvious, an older child raising younger ones, but more often it's invisible, a quiet transfer of responsibility written into daily life. It begins with small things, fetching a pacifier, making their own breakfast, pretending not to need help. But soon it seeps into identity. I am the one who holds things together. And that belief follows them for life. In adulthood, they become the reliable friend, the steady partner, the employee who never breaks down. They are loved for their calmness, but unseen for their exhaustion. It looks like kindness, but it's a disguise. It looks like patience, but it's repression. It looks like strength, but it's a story learned too early. Most parents never intend it. They love both children deeply, but the baby's cries are louder. The elder's silence is easier. And so love flows toward the noise, not the need. If you've ever been the elder child, you might remember that invisible promotion. No ceremony, no congratulations, just the weight of being the big one now. You remember learning that grown-ups get tired, that your job is to help, that your feelings come second. You learned that peace in the house depended on your behavior. And in that lesson, something sacred shifted. Your sense of safety began depending on performance. And when safety depends on performance, love becomes conditional. You start earning what should have been given. You start working for what should have been felt. The little boy learned to love like a parent, but he was never loved like a child again. That's how a 3-year-old grows up too soon, not by years, but by expectations, not by age, but by silence. And decades later, when he stands in a boardroom or a hospital or a kitchen, smiling at everyone, holding everything together, no one will see that the same child still lives behind his calmness, still waiting for someone to say, "You don't have to be strong right now. You can just be held." Because that's the secret of the elder child. They never stop being the caretaker. They just forget they were once the one who needed care most.
There's a strange moment in every older sibling's life when play quietly turns into duty. It doesn't announce itself. No one says, "You're the grown-up now." But one day, you're asked to watch the baby for just a minute, and that minute becomes your childhood's trade. He learns that good children help. He learns that tired parents smile more softly when he behaves. And slowly, helping becomes a habit that glues his sense of worth together. Psychologists call this parentification, when a child takes on emotional or practical roles beyond their age. It's not born from cruelty. It's born from exhaustion, from the beautiful chaos of families doing their best. But to the child, it feels like a quiet promotion, one he never applied for. At 3, he brings diapers and claps when the baby giggles. At 5, he fetches bottles before anyone asks. By 7, he already knows the rhythm of someone else's needs better than his own. He learns the power of being helpful and the cost of being needed. Because with every praise, "You're such a big boy. We couldn't do it without you," something inside whispers, "Don't stop." Affection becomes currency. Performance becomes love. When he's scolded, he doesn't cry, he negotiates. He tries to fix things. Children like him grow skilled at reading rooms, tiny weather forecasters of emotion. They sense tension before it breaks. They soothe, they distract, they make peace. It looks mature, it wins admiration, but underneath it builds fatigue. Imagine living in a home where you're both child and caretaker, too small to carry burdens, too proud to drop them. That's the paradox of the elder child. He becomes invisible not because no one loves him, but because everyone depends on him. At school, he helps others tie their shoes. He never interrupts. He listens like an adult trapped in a child's seat. And when someone finally asks what he wants, the question feels foreign, like a word he forgot how to pronounce. In families with 2 small children, studies show that the eldest often develops early empathy and advanced responsibility. But the same research notes higher levels of guilt and anxiety because they believe peace depends on them. He watches his parents argue softly in the kitchen about bills, about sleep, about time. And even though no one says it's his fault, his mind records the scene differently. If I behave better, maybe they'll rest. If I stay quiet, maybe they'll stop fighting. This is how guilt sneaks in, disguised as care. Years later, this same pattern grows roots. He becomes the friend who never complains, the colleague who picks up extra work, the partner who keeps everything fine, until one day, fine collapses under its own weight. When he finally cries, it startles even him. Because he spent so long being steady, even sadness feels like rebellion. That's what happens when responsibility outpaces age. Emotion freezes behind competence. There's a photo somewhere of him holding his baby brother's hand on the way to preschool. Everyone remembers the cuteness. No one remembers the pressure. That single frame contains the entire thesis of his life. Protect first, feel later. But here's the nuance. Not all responsibility wounds. When guided gently, it can sculpt incredible strength. The problem isn't growing up early. It's growing up alone, without permission to be small again, to fail, to rest. Healthy families eventually hand the role back. They remind the elder child, you don't have to fix everything. But many never notice he kept the keys. So adulthood becomes an echo chamber of that first lesson: be useful or be invisible. He learns to measure his value in outcomes: grades, promotions, clean dishes, calm voices. He doesn't know how to exist without a checklist, and rest feels suspicious, like laziness disguised as peace. Yet beneath all of this lies something quietly heroic. The elder child is the keeper of continuity. He bridges chaos and calm, interprets the unspoken, and preserves love when others are too tired to. He becomes the emotional translator of the family, fluent in sighs, pauses, and half-finished sentences. Still, that fluency comes with a cost. He forgets his own language. Ask him what joy feels like, and he'll hesitate. Ask him what guilt feels like, and he'll have examples. In therapy rooms, many firstborns describe a haunting phrase: I feel old inside. It's not just maturity, it's mileage. They've traveled emotional distances most adults never map. But understanding this truth doesn't need to end in sadness. Awareness is the beginning of return. The moment he realizes that his worth isn't tied to usefulness, that love doesn't need constant proof, he begins to reclaim the child he left behind. Sometimes that healing starts in small acts: saying no without apology, asking for help without guilt, laughing without checking if someone else is okay first. These are the rebellions that rebuild innocence. Because growing up too soon doesn't mean you missed your chance at peace. It just means your story began earlier than most. And every story that starts early still has time to rest, to play, to breathe again.
Growing up as the eldest teaches you one truth early: love often comes wrapped in responsibility. But adulthood teaches you another: peace only comes when you finally unwrap it. For years, he lived by invisible rules: be good, be strong, be useful. He didn't realize those rules were optional. They were survival codes, not laws of nature. Then one day, life stopped letting him hide behind competence. A burnout, a heartbreak, maybe just an ordinary morning when even coffee couldn't keep him upright. He looked in the mirror and saw not a hero, not a caretaker, just someone tired of being everyone's solution. That moment wasn't failure. It was the beginning of freedom. Because all transformation starts with exhaustion, the kind that no sleep can fix. It's the soul whispering, "You've carried enough." He began to notice how often he said, "I'm fine," when he wasn't. How many times he smiled instead of asking for help. How many quiet yes replies were actually small betrayals of his own needs. Awareness didn't come as lightning. It arrived like dawn, slow but unstoppable. He started small, saying no without guilt, letting someone else lead, crying once without apologizing for it. And every time he did, a piece of his childhood, the one he'd traded for duty, came back to him. At first it felt selfish, then it felt human. He realized love was never meant to be earned through performance. It was meant to be received through presence. That the people who truly love you don't need you perfect, they need you real. Psychologists call this reparenting, when adults finally give themselves the gentleness they once gave everyone else. It isn't about blaming parents or rewriting history. It's about looking at the child inside you and saying the words you always needed to hear. You did enough. You were always enough. That sentence alone can change a life.
Slowly, his relationships began to shift. He stopped choosing people who only valued his reliability. He started choosing those who valued his rest. He learned that caring doesn't have to mean fixing, that being loved doesn't require exhaustion. He even began to forgive himself for the years he couldn't enjoy being young, because guilt has no purpose in healing. It only binds you to the past. Forgiveness is what cuts the thread. One afternoon, he visited his parents' home. His younger sibling, now taller, louder, full of opinions, teased him for being too serious. For once, he laughed, really laughed, without feeling the weight of example on his shoulders. He realized the burden he once carried alone had quietly dissolved across time. Everyone had grown. Everyone had learned. And for the first time, he allowed himself to simply be. Not the eldest, not the protector, not the perfect one. Just himself. He looked at his parents not as figures to please, but as people. Flawed, tired, trying. And in that realization came compassion. Not the pitying kind, but the freeing kind. The kind that says we all did our best with what we knew. Healing, it turns out, isn't about rewriting your story. It's about rereading it with gentler eyes. As he walked home that evening, he noticed the sky looked the same color it did when he was 3. Soft orange fading into blue. But this time, he wasn't racing to grow up or prove his worth. He just stood there, letting the wind move through him, feeling small in the best possible way. Because the real victory of the eldest child is not achievement, it's permission. Permission to rest, permission to receive, permission to exist without earning it. He smiled quietly to himself. Maybe, he thought, being strong isn't about never falling apart. Maybe it's about knowing you can rebuild, again and again, and still find beauty in the cracks. And that's how the story ends, not with a lesson shouted from a stage, but with a whisper of peace. The kind that finally says, you don't have to hold the world anymore. It's always been holding you.